Hello everyone, I'm Morali, and this is a very different video from what I usually do. I usually talk about lore or things like that, but with the recent reveal of the catalyst for the Elementalist for End of Dragons, and a little bit of controversy that I've seen on social media with people being kind of upset about getting a melee spec again for the Elementalist, and a lot of people just kind of asking for a long range like mage spec and stuff like that. I thought to kind of talk about something that I've been talking about on my streams for a while now. It started off with talking about doing a revision for older skills, and specifically on one of the recent streams we talked about the Elementalist staff. And I know that some people are going to disagree with me on this stuff, and I am not an expert, I'm not a game developer or anything like that, but I thought it would be really fun to maybe talk about revisiting the staff skills and kind of looking at them and seeing how we could make them better. And these are just some suggestions that I have. Of course, like I said, I'm not a game developer. I'm not a PvP player. I'm not good with like the numbers and stuff like that. These are just ideas that I have where I think this could shine, primarily for PvE, of course, primarily for open world content and stuff. So that's kind of what I'm looking at, because I do think that the staff is a good weapon, but I just think there's certain areas where it could be improved a little bit. And if you do small little improvements here and there for the weapon skills and stuff, I think it goes a long way for the whole set, just because you have 20 different skills, you know, and it is a lot of skills. And just looking at the skills, sometimes you could maybe make the weapon overpowered if you increase something too much. So just making slight tweaks here and there for the different skills, I think will go a long way. So I kind of wanted to say that up front. Now let's get into it. So first off, before I go into any of the specific skills, I think one thing that kind of needs to change is all of the auto attacks seem to be very slow. And I understand that on Fireball, for example, now this hits 3 targets and it has the potential of doing a ton of damage and stuff. So I don't think that necessarily on the Fireball you would have to have a decrease in the cast time, but I think on the other ones like Water Blast and Stoning and Chain Lightning, I think that having them cast a little bit faster would already be huge. But that's not necessarily, I kind of wanted to say that for all of those skills. I think that maybe having that be a shorter cast time would be pretty nice. So with that being said, let's get into fire. So I think overall the fire attunement for the staff skills, I think those are all pretty solid. And I have to say that because ArenaNet, whenever they have revisited the elemental skills, I feel like from what I have seen, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I feel like they concentrate a lot on the fire, because the fire is how you do most of your damage. And I have a big problem with that. I really think that with a class that can swap between different attunements, it would be nice to get some extra damage on other attunements. I understand that the other attunements are there for other things, like you have water for healing and you have earth for protection and bleeding and conditions and stuff like that. Like, I understand that there's like the other attunements are there for something. I just think that maybe spreading out the damage a little bit would be nice, because if you're not in fire and you're in water, for example, you lose out on a ton of DPS just because you're healing your allies, which is nice to be able to do that, but I think there's certain classes that can do both at the same time. If you're looking at the Revenant, for example, I could, for example, have dual sword, and if I wanted to swap to healing, I could just go into Ventari, which isn't that great of a healing spec, but it can dish out pretty decent healing. And at the same time, with my dual swords, I can still do a ton of damage, you know, especially if you have the Renegade, you can have your spirits out and just swap to the Ventari Legend and just use your tablet in like really short succession. You can just pump out a ton of alacrity and a ton of healing on top of doing a ton of damage with your spirits and stuff. So I really think that just spreading out the damage among the other attunements would be really nice. And I'm not saying to lower the damage on the fire skills, because I think that's what the fire attunement is all about, is doing damage and stuff, but I just think that maybe spreading it out. So with that being said, let's get into fire fire. So fireball I think is pretty solid already, and maybe lower the cast time a little bit, make it like a little bit shorter. It is a 1 second cast time. Maybe do it like the other ones, they're all 3/4 of a second. So maybe doing that, having 3/4 of a second for cast time would be pretty cool. But other than that, I think it's a pretty solid skill. It does pretty good damage. It does what it's supposed to do. Same with Lava Fawn. I think Lava Fawn being an instant cast is like really nice and stuff. Maybe increase the like area. It doesn't necessarily have to be, but I think that by itself was already like a pretty solid skill, especially having that trade where you go down and you cast the Lava Fawn and stuff. I think it's pretty good. So then I want to talk about Flame Burst, which is the 3 skill. I think that having just like a one-time attack where you just kind of dish out some burning on enemies is just not quite enough. I feel like maybe having it where you cast it and yes, it does its instant burning, but maybe have it pulse for like 3 seconds, where you have it pulse every second for burning, and then maybe lower the target number. If you do 3 pulses and you only have 3 targets, you altogether get 9 targets, which right now it has 5 targets. So I think I'm kind of like doing like a trade-off there. That would be interesting, and maybe that will be able to like stack your burning a little bit more too, if you have like a lot of condition duration and stuff like that, depending on how they wanted to tweak that or whatever. But I think that would just make it more interesting, because I just feel like once you use it, it just goes on its cooldown, and then there's not much you can do with it, and it's just on cooldown. It's just this quick attack kind of. It just kind of feels lame. So I feel like maybe having something where it like persists for a little bit, for like 3 seconds, where it just pulses out some burning, would be really cool. Then the next skill is the Burning Retreat. Now this is something that I talked about specifically on the stream recently. I think that maybe changing that to an ammo skill would be really nice. Maybe having like 2 or 3. I think 3 might be a bit much, but having like 2 on the ammo skill, because it's really just like an evade. It leaves a small little line of a fire field which does burning and stuff, but not necessarily enemies are gonna run right into it. And the utility of this skill is really like being able to get away from enemies, because as an elementalist you are very squishy. So I think maybe having that as an ammo skill would be really nice, and it would just kind of be reminiscent of like how the avatar of Balthazar in the personal story, you kind of can like jump around, and it's kind of the same thing. It's like a burning retreat, but you can do it multiple times where you jump around like twice in a row. So that would be really nice. I think that would be my change there. And then Meteor Shower seems okay, but I also think that specifically with the Meteor Shower, they have fidgeted with it so much in the past that I wouldn't want to touch that at this point. I think what they have kind of come to seems to be pretty solid. So I wouldn't really want to mess with that and change a lot of it. And it seems to be doing good damage and stuff. So like I said, fire overall I think is pretty good. Just little tweaks here and there. Maybe increase some stuff to kind of keep it up to par and stuff like that. So that would be really nice. Now next up we have water. Now as everyone knows, I'm a huge fan of being a water mage, water elementalist. I actually have 3 elementalists, and I kind of keep being in water with them. I really love it. In Guild Wars 1 I played a lot of water skills, a lot of water attunement and stuff, but I was like damage based, and you could do that in Guild Wars 1, and I kind of miss that. And I'm not saying that I want water attunement to be as strong as fire. God knows the identity of the attunements would kind of be ruined in that sense, but I just think that there's a lot of stuff they could update on some of the skills, like I've said before, and specifically there's some stuff that I have ideas for water. So the first skill is Water Blast, and I think I have a problem with the Scepter skill 3 being a water trident. I really think they should swap this to go into staff. I think it is pretty apparent now that ArenaNet is trying to stay away from bringing underwater weapons on land. I think we see this with the 3rd set now of elite specializations, and they still haven't brought them on land. So I don't think we're ever going to see a trident on land, or at least there's not that much hope that I have for that. But I think maybe changing Water Blast to be Water Trident and maybe doing something else for the Scepter would be really interesting, or maybe even swapping them completely, just to give it the visuals and the identity of like it's a trident, which is more like a staff kind of thing. And I think it would just really go, not necessarily changing what the skills themselves do, because Water Trident does give a ton of healing and regeneration and stuff, so you don't necessarily need that. But I think for Water Blast / Water Trident, whatever you would call that at that point, maybe increase the damage of it. It really doesn't do a ton of damage, and it would just be nice to kind of help out with DPS. I mean, I think putting a little bit of damage on the Water Blast, like adding some more damage to it, wouldn't make it super overpowered and wouldn't be like game breaking, but it would just be nice to kind of help out if you're swapping into water to heal, maybe to have still still some sustain in your damage there, and you're not losing a ton of DPS when you're in there, specifically in like open world and stuff like that, where enemies die really fast and stuff. And talking about damage, I think maybe having the damage, I think this should be something that happens on a lot of the auto attacks, but I'll talk about that when we get into the other ones. But maybe having it be an AoE, maybe not like Fireball where it's 3, maybe having it like 2 or something, which, you know, would be kind of strange, but maybe having some AoE in there. It, like I said, it doesn't do much damage as is, so it wouldn't be that bad to have it like splash out some damage when it hits the enemy. So maybe doing that just kind of would update Water Blast, pick some of those changes, you know, whatever, but those are just some ideas that I have for that. Now for Ice Spike, there's one particular thing, and I talked about this on the stream, that I really hate, is that it just takes forever for that Ice Spike to form and then drop down. By the time that I do that, 99% of the time, the enemies, specifically I'm talking about open world here, they're dead. The enemies that I'm targeting that are in that area, unless it's a champion or a boss or whatever, they're usually dead, and there's no point to have that in a group setting. If I'm fighting by myself, then yes, okay, I can totally see that, because it does give vulnerability and stuff, and it does do really good damage actually, but the problem is it just takes forever for the Ice Spike to form. So I would like to like even half that. I mean, if it's half the time that it takes for that spike to drop, that would be just really nice. And I'm not saying lower the cooldown of it, just keep the cooldown the way it is. It's a super low cooldown as is, but the problem just is that enemies just die so quickly in PvE that the spike doesn't hit the enemies a lot of the times when I use that skill. So just having that would be really nice. Next up is Geyser. Now Geyser is interesting because you actually have a Geyser when you revive on your arcane. There's a trade where you can do that, where you cast one. I would just have one small change that I would do to that, because I think it's a pretty solid skill in what it's supposed to do, because it kind of just heals and then it revives if you have that trade and stuff. I like that. I think it's pretty cool. They could keep it that way, but I just think that maybe having a little bit of knockback on that, if there's enemies on that field that they get knocked back, that would be really nice, and it would just kind of add a little bit of CC to the class and maybe help you out with when you're fighting a boss or something, getting that break bar down a little bit. And it would just be really interesting if you go to revive a friend and the geyser, the water spout, like comes out and knocks back enemies. That would be kind of like how it works for the Guardian, where that shield, when you do this, you have that trait as well on the Guardian where you revive and you get that shield and it knocks back enemies. It doesn't have to be like a huge knockback, but it'd just be really nice to have that. It's like a little bit of quality of life to that whole idea, and that would just kind of improve the skill plenty. Now next is Frozen Ground, and that is the one where I would probably make the biggest changes on that set, because I just think that chill by itself is not that huge of a condition, right? It doesn't do that much to really qualify to be like one of the top conditions. It's nice for PvP, but there is a lot of cleanse, and I don't know a lot about PvP, but I just think in PvE it doesn't do that much, and I think it has potential to be actually really good, and I'll get into that right now. So I think maybe adding damage every second an enemy stays in there, and it doesn't have to be a huge amount of damage. I'm not saying that it should do like 5,000 damage every second. I'm saying like having a few hundred points of damage there for the 5 targets that are in it would be really nice, because it is a quick cast and it is a nice sized AoE. It'd just be really nice to have that for a PvE setting, where if I'm looking at a group of enemies, just casting that Frozen Ground and just having on top of the chill doing some damage. I don't think that would be super overpowered. I don't think that would break the identity of the water attunement itself. It would just be, again, a little bit of quality of life, adding a little bit of DPS, because again, I'm swapping to water attunement and I'm losing DPS because I'm in there. And yes, I can heal a ton, but it'd just be nice to be able to get a little bit more damage out there. Now, I would also lower the cooldown. It does have a pretty long cooldown for just what it does. It just applies chill, but it has like a long cooldown. And I understand that you don't want to lower them too much, because you can swap to other attunements, and being able to just cast all the stuff really quickly might just be a little bit OP, but I just think having a couple of seconds that you take off the cooldown would just like really help it being a pretty decent skill. And again, right now all it does is chill, and if you're in a group setting, the enemy is most likely going to be chilled anyways, because there's so many other other classes that can apply chill, so many different traits that can apply it, so many different utility skills that can do it. I don't think it would be huge to have like, oh my god, this ability is like on a 15-second cooldown, and then you have the trait and it goes to like a 13 or 12-second cooldown or whatever. If you have the lower recharge time on that, like that's not game breaking because it really just chills, and that's not that huge. And even if you blast it, you just get frost ore out of it, which is super accessible if you're in Tempest anyways. You can give that out every few seconds if you trade for that. But then I have a couple of ideas where they can improve it even more, and I think those are really interesting ideas. So I would maybe like to see a sliding effect. We have seen that they have in recent years added stuff to that where they can affect like the player in the movement, the way they do it and stuff, and maybe having the enemy like slide on it would be interesting for like a PvP aspect, and you cast the frozen ground on the actual like the point that you have in Conquest or whatever, and sliding around and stuff would be really interesting. I think it would be something that would like add a whole different aspect to it, quality of life again, I think, to that skill. Or not necessarily a slide skill, but a slip effect. Now we have Icy Ground for the Snowball Mayhem during Winter's Day, and the Icy Ground actually when you cast it actually does like a little slip effect where the enemy kind of gets like thrown around, and that might be a bit much, but maybe having something where it does like a small version of that where it's not necessarily like this giant like knockback or something, but like maybe having something like that where the enemy like gets knocked down and slips down for a second maybe, or something like that, again kind of adding to the whole idea of maybe helping out with break bars and stuff like that. So kind of having that, again, quality of life, and again I don't think that would make it super OP because once again you're trading off with like other stuff. You always have a trade-off with the Elementalist because you're always in one of the attunements and you don't get all of your skills at any time, and even if you swap you still have the cooldown for your attunements and stuff, so I think that wouldn't be too terrible to have in there. And last, for the water attunement we have Healing Rain, and I think Healing Rain itself is actually pretty good. It's a pretty large AoE, it cleanses conditions, it gives regeneration, it's a water field. I think everything that it's supposed to be, it does pretty good. The recharge is, I think for what it does, is pretty good, so I wouldn't really actually change anything in there. Maybe have it where it like grows a little bit. We have seen those fields, and I've talked about this before, where I really wish they would utilize more of the like growing AoEs. They don't really use that enough, I feel like. So maybe having that where the like the rain grows to like even larger AoE or something over the duration that it has. But other than that, I would just kind of leave it the way it is. I think it's a pretty good skill, and I think it does what it's supposed to really well. So next up we have the air attunement. Now in air I have not that many changes, but I think have some pretty interesting just quality of life. A lot of stuff just really needs some quality of life. I think particularly air has a lot of stuff on the staff skills. It screams so much 2012 because it really doesn't do much, right? So let's get into the skills. So Chain Lightning I think is pretty good. Bouncing around and stuff, that's pretty good. It's a nice AoE in that way and stuff, but I just think maybe adding some vulnerability on it. We get a ton of vulnerability already throughout all the different skills in the whole game and stuff, but I just think having that for like an auto attack, you know, if I'm fighting someone solo, it'd be nice to have an easier accessible way of just getting some vulnerability that would just really help in solo play. If you're in a group setting, 99% of the time if you're fighting a boss or something, they have 25 vulnerability on them at any time anyways, because so much stuff gives vulnerability. So maybe just having a little bit of vulnerability in there, helping you out in like some solo play and stuff. Other than that, I think the skill is pretty nice. Next we have Lightning Surge. Now that one is a really strange one. I think the cast time on it is a little bit long for what it does, because it doesn't do that huge of an amount of damage, and it only does like a blind for a short duration. So I think maybe shorten the cast time and lowering the cooldown, kind of bringing it up to par to some of the other skills that we have in game that cause blindness and stuff, I think would be really nice. So just some quality of life stuff. I wouldn't really change much there because of what it's supposed to do. I think it's pretty good. You could increase the damage, but I don't think that's really necessary on what it does. So next up is Gust. Now Gust I have some changes for, where I think Gust itself itself, when you look at the skill, it's a pretty useless skill. It does a short knockback, which if you look at other classes, there's so much knockback and so many things you can do on other classes. You know, skills on other classes that do knockbacks but also do something else. Gust doesn't even do damage, and I find that kind of ridiculous. Like we have a skill that doesn't even do damage. I find that kind of really strange. It's just a knockback and it doesn't do any damage, and it has like a pretty long cooldown too. So I think adding some damage, maybe lowering the cooldown there, and then I have like a couple of things with the actual projectile. So it's one projectile that's tied to the ground actually, and it can be blocked by like a little bit of elevation and stuff like that if there like is a little small ledge or something. So I think having that be a wind skill, I don't know why it's tied to the ground. That seems kind of strange to me. So I would have it maybe where it's an actual above ground projectile. They might have to like actually change the animation of it or something. But I think that would just help it out being like an actual projectile that like flies through the air would just be a little bit better. But then also, instead of just having it as one projectile that hits enemies in a row, maybe having like 3 projectiles come out and like fork out. Because again, like I said, it's not that huge of a skill, and there's a ton of knockback skills that can knock back a lot of enemies. You look at like, for example, the Guardian Shield 5 skill, on top of like healing, it can push back a ton of enemies. If you're right in their face, you can knock back a ton of them. But with the Gust, you have to like really line it up and you have to like really aim for it, and that just seems kind of not really fitting. I'm not huge on that. So maybe having where it like instead of 1 projectile, it sends out like 3 projectiles and still only hits like a maximum of 5 targets maybe could still be a thing. I think that would be pretty nice to have some quality of life there. Next up is Windborne Speed, and this is again to me screams 2012 because it doesn't really do that much. It gives you swiftness and it removes some of the movement based conditions. That's about it. That's all it does. We've really seen an influx of the new boons that have been added to the game, kind of spread out throughout, particularly like super speed and quickness and alacrity and stuff. So I could maybe see like instead of doing just swiftness, maybe do swiftness and super speed, or maybe swiftness and quickness. We don't have like any quickness on this entire set, so I would like to see some maybe quickness on there. That would be really nice to be able to like cast a lot of stuff, specifically if we're talking about like air magic. It's called Windborne Speed, so maybe making yourself quicker with some wind magic I think would really fit into that, and it wouldn't be that game breaking to give yourself a few seconds of quickness on there, being able to cast a lot of stuff. So I think that would just really bring it up to par with some of the other stuff that we have on other weapon sets and stuff. And then last but not least, we have Static Field, and Static Field I think is pretty decent what it does. I think I would just add one small change. So in order for that to be an effective skill, you need to have enemies run into it, and I find a lot of times that enemies don't do that. In PvE, enemies just stand still, so you have to knock them into it with Gust or whatever, and in PvP it's a pretty big visual I think, so it's probably fairly easy to avoid. So I think maybe having something that compares to Chaos Storm. So recently with the Chaos Storm on the Mesmer, they have updated it to cause the daze right up front instead of being like one of the random conditions that it can apply or whatever. And I think maybe having the Static Field give out 1 second of stun on all the enemies that are in the field when it's cast would be really interesting, because that again would give you a little bit of break bar, and it would kind of give utility even in PvE where enemies don't necessarily move, to give yourself some actual usage out of that skill. And it's just a 1 second stun, and if you like knock them into the field, it can still do its like 2 second stun or whatever. That would just still be fine. But I just think given it like a little bit of more utility, maybe a little bit more like way of doing damage or something, if you add like some damage to that stun and help out with some break bar on the boss, where you can cast Lightning Surge, which does blind, and you have Gust, which does a knockback, and then you have Static Field, and then you can swap to something else. You know, just helping out with break bars and stuff I think would be really nice to have as a utility, because you just don't have that much break bar damage on the staff skills. So I think that pretty much wraps it up for the air there, and I think that is because a lot of it is just like quality of life, kind of bringing it up to like 2021 instead of like 2012, which I feel like some of those skills really are stuck at. And then the last one is Earth. So Earth is really interesting because I think that some of the skills are wacky, kind of strange when you look at them. On top of Earth seems to be this like condition-based stuff, right? Because it talks about like a ton of bleeding, right? There's a ton of bleeding on it. But I think specifically the staff skills for the Elementalist in Earth Attunement don't do that much bleeding when you really look at them. So I have a couple of changes that I would like to see. So specifically, let's get into the skills. So specifically stoning, I would add a bleed to that. I know it weakens the enemy, and weaken is pretty nice and stuff, but it's not like super huge, and it's not super useful specifically on PvE settings and stuff where everything dies really fast anyways, and it's pretty much about killing the enemy quicker than it can kill you kind of thing. So maybe adding some bleed to it to kind of give it the identity of like, hey, this really is a condition-based attunement kind of thing. And then maybe even have like an explode. We have the AoE skill for the fire, and I kind of proposed one for the water blast, but I think maybe having like a little explosion where it does like bleed to like 3 enemies around and does like a little bit of extra damage would be nice. And I also think like maybe increasing the projectile speed. The stone that you throw is like really slow, and to me it seems very like unrealistic the way that it floats. It floats through the air rather than being thrown, right? And I think particularly, I think they can look at the Scepter 1 skill for the Earth Attunement. I think that one does pretty well, where you kind of like, you send out these like stone shards and they're pretty fast. I think maybe looking at that, and they do bleeding as well. I think maybe looking at that and maybe imitating that skill a little bit, not making it exactly the same, but I think it would be fairly nice to maybe have that, maybe have a little bit of identity in there for the stoning there. And then I want to talk about Eruption. And when you look at the skill set, and I've talked about this on the stream actually, I think that, and this is probably my biggest change that I have, you need to change this completely. I think swapping Shockwave, which is the 5 skill, and Eruption is probably the best thing to do here. Eruption, the 2 skill, is so much stronger than your Shockwave, and I think by swapping that around, you could even increase the damage and increase the bleeding, and of course you could swap the like cooldowns and maybe even the cast times or whatever of the skills. But I just think that Eruption being so much stronger than the 5 skill just seems kind of strange, because the 5 skill is usually supposed to be the one that does like the big damage, or that's the strong skill that's on the longer cooldown kind of thing. But I think with the Earth Attunement on the staff there, it kind of really strange. And I think again, this is like remnants of being from 2012 and just not having been updated. So I think swapping them around, maybe increasing the amount of bleeding that it does, because bleeding is not that strong of a condition even if you like really trade for it and stuff like that. So I think just increasing that and increasing the damage and stuff. But then also I have a problem with the explosion. This kind of goes back to the ice spike that we have for the Elementalist. The ice spike again takes forever to drop down, and so is the eruption. The actual explosion on the eruption takes forever, and again in PvE that's horrible because all the enemies die before you can even do anything there. They have changed the meteor shower to where it does the most damage on the first tick, because to kind of avoid that where it takes a long time for the damage to really like ramp up or whatever, and instead it goes like with the strongest damage first and then it lowers it. I just think that with Eruption and Ice Spike they can't really do that, but I think maybe having it where it just casts the eruption, the actual eruption happens faster. It doesn't have to be like super quick or whatever, but I just think it would be really nice to have that in PvE and just bring it up to snuff with like some of the other stuff. Next we have a Magnetic Aura, and I actually think that it's totally fine the way it is, but I think the reason that it's totally fine the way it is because they have recently changed a lot of the aura skills, which actually give you a flip over skill, which is the newer skill. So again, that kind of speaks to how outdated all the other skills are, because this skill feels pretty nice, but it's because it's a newer skill, right? Magnetic Aura has always been in there, but the flip over skill is a new skill, and I think that skill itself is nice and it does pretty well. That being said, it's a newer skill. That's why it feels so good, because it's been recently made with the current balance in mind kind of thing, and I think that that speaks volumes for all the other skills, more so than for itself. So yeah, but that's magnetic aura. I think I would kind of keep it the way it is on that. Next up, we have unsteady ground, and then unsteady ground I think suffers from the same thing that some of the air attunement skills kind of suffer from, and that's like the being stuck in 2012. Again, it blocks enemies from passing, but it doesn't do anything other than that, and that kind of seems not very useful to me. Again, I think they could add like a cripple to it, maybe do some damage every second for enemies that are standing on it, if that's even possible, or maybe anytime they get knocked back, add some damage to it, or maybe even some bleed, or something like that. But I just really think that it's not that ideal of a skill. It really doesn't do much in PvE. In PvE, it's like a totally useless skill because it doesn't do much. I compare it to how the Earth Elementals have an unsteady ground ability as well, which I believe causes bleeding and cripple on you and does damage every second. I kind of would like to see the same thing for the Elementalist. I don't think that would really ruin the identity of the skill. I just think that it brings it up to where we are right now, 9 years later in the game. It's just outdated, I think, and it just needs a little bit extra there. So maybe adding some damage, some cripple, some bleed or something anytime it knocks an enemy back. So last skill on this is the shockwave. So I've already talked about eruption, so I would swap these two. So this would be your new 2 skill, and I think that it does 1 bleeding for 20 seconds. Specifically in PvP, I feel like that's cleansed so fast that that doesn't even matter, and it doesn't immobilize, which is pretty nice. But again, once an enemy cleanses, you usually don't just cleanse one condition, you cleanse like multiple a lot of times, so you kind of lose that identity. And again, I'm not a PvP player, I'm just kind of want to point that out when I see stuff like that. But then again, we talk about PvE, and it's kind of useless because again, you have to line up the enemies because it's in a line, and again, it's bound to the ground, which I don't think is that bad of an idea for this particular skill because it's an earth attunement skill and it is called shockwave. So I think that's still pretty good for its identity. But maybe just increasing the bleed on it instead of 1, at least having like 3 on it, or maybe doing more damage on it or something. Not sure, but I just think that maybe increasing some of the stuff. And then again, just like how air had it where the air attunement had the gust, I think changing the projectiles to maybe having 3 projectiles that fork out again, just to give it that AoE feel. You don't have to line up the enemies, you can hit them without having to line them up, and it just makes it easier for you to like use that skill. So overall, I want to say that I think the problem that we mostly have with the staff elementalist is that it's kind of stuck in this thing where some of the skills have been updated recently, specifically a lot of the fire skills and stuff, and they've been brought up to like current balance, and a lot of the skills have been just left behind, and that's why the staff doesn't feel that good. I think really just doing an update to those skills can still make the elementalist feel really good, especially if you have the weaver where you even get your dual attack skills, which are pretty much up to snuff. When you look at those skills, those are pretty up there with the current balance. Maybe you could tune some of those as well, but I think those are better than a lot of the main regular skills. So I think kind of like giving it that little bit of like actually being a mage and actually giving it the long range ability that it's supposed to have just kind of evens out with the squishiness of the elementalist. I just think a lot of those skills are left behind, and I think that would maybe even work out with some of the stuff that we see on the catalyst. We haven't seen much about it. This is being recorded before the beta where you can play them and stuff, so I don't know what the catalyst is going to bring, but I just think that bringing up those staff skills could really make it feel like we have a long range option that's pretty decent. I just think staff isn't there where it needs to be in order to be competitive with all the other stuff. You look at some of the other weapons that we have in the game and they just seem to do so much more, and I understand that fire attunement is there to do damage. I totally understand that, but I hate for the elementalist to completely just rely on fire to do damage, and I just think that it's not even that OP in the damage department that I could say like, oh my god, the elementalist is so overpowered, overpowered if you're constantly in fire. I just have to be in fire in order to even do a decent amount of damage. I just think giving it some quality of life, updating some of those skills, swapping some of those skills around, you know, doing the little things that I proposed, like I said, I don't think would make it super overpowered, would just make it feel a little bit on par with the current other sets that we have of weapons, and gives the Elementalist a nice long range option of being an actual mage class. So let me know what you guys think down below. I understand that these are just ideas, but I want to hear what everyone thinks. I'm just throwing some stuff out there. I'm not trying to piss anyone off. I'm not trying to say, oh, this sucks or that sucks, or make the Elementalist overpowered. That is not my goal. I just want to put out my thoughts. Let me know what you guys think, and let me know if you want to see other stuff. I have other ideas for other skills, for other weapon sets. Let me know if you want to hear my thoughts on those as well, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye guys.